Chat? It's dark in here? Or is it me? Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alo Kanoja. I'm a psychiatrist. Just a reminder, everything we discuss on stream today is intended to be for educational purposes only, and nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice. So if y'all have a medical concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Yeah. So welcome to another stream. We've got some super cool stuff today, okay? So this is kind of interesting, but we're kind of like learning more about how to help this community. And by this community, I don't know exactly what that means anymore. Like, I don't know. So the demographics of who watches us and who benefits from us has changed rapidly over the last 2 years. We're much more closer to an even gender split. Our average age seems to be going up by a couple of years. So like our average age now for our audience is like 30. So we still do have like a bunch of like teenagers and stuff that watch our content and stuff, but we also have a bunch of people who are professionals, a little bit older, like 40s, even parents who are in their 50s and 60s, who have kids in their 20s. So things are changing rapidly, and what we're trying to do is understand a little bit more about how to help y'all. And we've learned a lot. So we worked more and more with game devs, or just programmers and developers in general. So, a lot of our coaching clients have been game developers. I was at the GDC on Friday, and so devs seem to be like, I think they can benefit a lot from what we have to offer. So what we've decided to do is actually pilot a program that's specifically oriented towards helping people with their careers. And it includes a lot of the stuff that we're going to kind of talk about today. So we're going to talk a little bit. There's a fantastic blog post by a game dev about stress in the industry that we're going to kind of go through. It has some neuroscience stuff kind of baked in there. We're going to talk a little bit about the science of what this game dev is talking about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the experience of what it's like to be a developer, why it's stressful, why burnout is at an all-time high, and a little bit about what you can do about it. But this is something that, we can cover this post and stuff, but there's like so much more to it. There's a practical application side. Y'all can sign up for that wait list. I don't know exactly where. Hopefully I'll find out soon. But, this is the kind of thing where we're sort of noticing that as we work with more and more developers, we can synthesize what is helpful to, let's say, 100 different developers and equip our coaches with sort of a game plan to help developers with the most common problem, most common like career-oriented issues as well. So we're going to dig into some of that today. Let's see, maybe y'all will find it interesting, maybe you won't. But anyway, so it's cool. I'm pretty excited to talk about, go through the blog post, sort of share try to analyze what this person is thinking, feeling, and then offer some guidance for people who are in unhealthy work situations and struggling to understand, first of all, what they're going through, and secondly, what we can do about it. Next thing is we're going to be reacting to some TikToks a little bit later. So we're going to be focusing on TikToks related to anxiety. So teaching a little bit about the basics of anxiety. That too, if y'all haven't heard, we have Dr. K's Guide to Anxiety, in which we cover a lot of this stuff. The guide is going to be a little bit more practical in terms of like, here's what you do, and here's sort of a comprehensive explanation of what anxiety is and what thought loops are and what's clinical anxiety and what's non-clinical anxiety. But we're absolutely going to just talk about the specifics of what is included in the TikToks. If y'all are interested in more of a comprehensive approach to anxiety, definitely check out Dr. K's Guide. So last thing is that we still have a few group coaching spots open. So we filled up quite a bit, but we have maybe 20 to 40 spots left. And so if y'all are interested in signing up, that's about 5% of our spots. Definitely sign up soon, because I imagine they'll be filled. Just a reminder that group coaching is actually like a really, really good way to do some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, especially in terms of like, learning how to listen, learning how to ask questions, learning how to introspect, learning how to increase your EQ. So some of those skills we actually teach in group coaching, and then we leverage those skills for other goals. So someone may come in and say, I'm struggling with my relationships. And so rather than working with an individual coach, there's a group of people who can help you explore that issue. It's all facilitated by a coach. And then you'll sort of learn a little bit about yourself. You'll learn a little bit about how to ask questions, how to be more reflective on your thought process. And then you can apply those skills to various goals, which is sort of what happens in the latter half of group coaching. So I see some people are saying group coaching is POG and group coaching is great. Getting a good group is crucial. Yeah. Good. So I'm glad that people are sort of enjoying. Is Gaia ONP is saying group coaching is way more fun than one-on-one. Completely agree. So that it's hard to describe. So the challenge is that like we can sort of, personal coaching is not exactly what we do on stream in terms of interviews, but people get like a closer sense of what it looks like. group coaching does tend to be a little bit more active and like a little bit more fun. So, it's hard to describe. It's like so hard to demonstrate what group coaching is like. So Type 2B saying, had 30 sessions of group coaching. It was the best thing I ever did. Good. I'm glad you really enjoyed it. When I was in group coaching, we had 6 out of 7 developers. Is that normal? Sort of. So this is where sometimes groups are more successful if they're more homogenous. That may be a little bit more normal in the sense that we have been seeing more and more developers kind of like enter into our community. So that's just like it's a high percentage of like I said, we've been helping developers a ton, and we synthesize what we learn from all of our coaches and all of our clients. And then we like put together things that will kind of like launch as a package for people to like go through and benefit from. Yeah, so Banana Balloon saying, hi, I've been watching your videos on YouTube a lot lately. They actually helped me start improving myself. I just wanted to say thank you for your contribution. You're most welcome. That's why we have videos on YouTube. That's also why we do formats besides interviews, because a lot of people are curious about that. And the other thing that's very cool is if we're lucky, we're going to get approved to do a study on how much watching YouTube can improve your mental health. Because we've seen some really interesting data about like concrete improvements in mental health from watching YouTube, which I know that people talk about the addictiveness of YouTube. We talk about how YouTube is ruining my life. We talk about YouTube as like an evil thing. We talk about social media as an evil thing, especially in academic medicine. There are all these studies about the dangers of social media, how social media is bad for your mental health. And all that stuff is true. We're not saying it isn't true, but there's another side to the coin, which I don't think the academic world has really like grasped yet. Right? Which is that YouTube, social media, Twitch, these are all platforms. And what you do with the platform determines the effect of the platform. So just like a microphone or megaphone, you can use that to have a hate speech oriented rally, or you can use it to have a concert, right? And what you use the tools for are ultimately going to determine what effect you have. Anyway. Okay. So, yeah. So if y'all, I see there are a lot of questions about group coaching. So there, I think we have Ask a Coach events on Discord. So we'll sometimes have events where it's kind of just open and people who are curious about like more specific questions, trying to figure out, is group coaching right for me? Is personal coaching right for me? Is coaching at all right for me? Should I go be seeing a therapist instead? Like all those kinds of questions. You know, a coach can't really assess you and say you should be seeing a therapist, but they can absolutely tell you whether they think coaching is appropriate for you or not. So y'all should definitely check those out. Cool. So I'm seeing there's just a lot of positivity in chat, which I'm really grateful for, everyone. But we've got cool stuff to get into. It's 12:15, and I don't want to lose sight of all that stuff. So I appreciate all the good vibes. I appreciate everyone sort of saying how much we've helped them and all that good stuff. Fantastic. So as much as I'd like to bask in that appreciation, there's something even cooler and better for y'all, which is we're going to dive into some of this content, which is really fantastic. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the games industry hurts people. So this was a post by Load Bearing Tomato, and we're not going to read the whole thing because it's pretty long. I highly, highly recommend y'all check it out if you are a developer. But we're going to just dig into this a little bit. Okay. So this is a post about the experience of a developer in the industry and how they've sort of explored a couple of concepts that seem to give them insight into what they're going through and how to manage it, okay? So this post started as a draft that contained 5 lines. Being locked in a bad work environment is not like being chased by a tiger that destroyed his cage. I have long forgotten the number of times I've been hurt or nearly killed at work, but I remember the ones that hurt my soul. So this is an article about where this person sort of talks about being trapped. So being like experiencing a lot of like adrenaline and sympathetic nervous system stuff. So being in a stressful environment and fundamentally being unable to act. And when you are in a stressful environment and you're unable to act, what does that do to you. And that's essentially what this person is kind of talking about. Okay? So he starts off by sort of talking a little bit about the sympathetic nervous system. So when activated, the sympathetic nervous system increases your blood pressure, heart rate, dilates the pupils, dumps adrenaline, ups the oxygen supply to your vital organs, readying you to fight for your life or run screaming into the woods. At its core, the sympathetic nervous system says, I can. So for those of y'all that have watched Dr. K's guide, we talk a lot about the sympathetic nervous system and things like that. So this is essentially correct, right? The human body evolved and built itself specifically to do this because most of the threats that governed whether we live or to reproduce had to be either killed or escaped from. Also, generally speaking, somewhat correct. Now, here's the really interesting thing. So we have this evolutionary system that is developed to protect us from life and death situations. But what if the situation doesn't make it so that you can fight or flee? So for better or worse, the human body also built itself another survival mechanism that's suspiciously suited to sitting in a design meeting with someone who gaslights you and seeks to undermine you at every turn, or to quietly attend class with someone who beats you. It's not what it evolved for, but our biology has a nervous system activation that fires when you must politely comply with social rules of interaction with someone who is actively harming you. We've all heard of this fight or flight nervous system activation. It's what tells you shit is going down, do something. Fight or flight is a call to action. It's a gas pedal. But in the workplace, you can't use the gas pedal the way nature intended. You can't upend the chairs of a meeting and barricade yourself with furniture, safe from your attacker. You certainly can't leap over the table and choke them until the threat subsides, right? Absolutely true. And now we're beginning to see a little bit about what this person's internal experience of the work environment is, right? So it's like you're pissed off, but you can't act, so you're kind of paralyzed. So you slam on the brakes despite what your body is telling you. What happens after that is one of the lesser known F's, freeze. So this is, now we're going to kind of talk a little bit about this. So there's this thing called polyvagal theory, which posits, so generally speaking, the way that our nervous system works is that we've got two modes. We have fight or flight, or we have rest and digest. So the fight or flight system is our sympathetic nervous system, which governs things like adrenaline, increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, also does things like dilates your pupils, increases blood flow to your peripheral limbs. So sends blood to your muscles, arm muscles, leg muscles, so that we can fight or run away. Our parasympathetic nervous system is governed by rest and digest. So this reroutes blood flow away from your brain, away from your limbs, to your internal organs, like your liver, your stomach, your intestines, your kidneys, because now we need all that blood to digest the meal that we just ate. For those of you that have experienced a food coma after having a healthy big meal, and you don't feel like doing anything, that's because your parasympathetic nervous system is engaged. Our parasympathetic nervous system involves relaxation, it involves chilling. Our sympathetic nervous system involves activity, motion. So if I'm playing a physical sport, I'm probably going to be like sympathetically active. Whereas if I'm playing even an FPS game, I may be sympathetically active. Whereas if I'm playing something like Timberborn or Civ or something like that, I may be a little bit more parasympathetically active. So there's something called polyvagal theory, which sort of posits that there's a third kind of region here called dorsal vagal, which is different from ventral vagal, which causes our, like, essentially our freeze response. So as you can see in this beautiful infographic, it sort of talks about, you know, joy, being in the present, groundedness, curiosity, compassion, mindful in the ventral. This seems like a good thing. This is sort of a bad thing, and this seems to be like a very bad thing. So it's helpless, conservation of energy, depression, numbness, dissociation, shame, shutdown, hopelessness, preparation for death, trapped, right? So this is like a bad thing. So people sort of thought that we can divide essentially the vagus nerve, which is a major parasympathetic nerve, into this ventral vagal and dorsal vagal kind of situation. So now let's read this a little bit, and then we'll kind of talk into this. But when the sympathetic nervous system fails to deal with that threat, the parasympathetic nervous system takes over again, and this time in the dorsal vagal emergency state. I can becomes I can't. As a last resort to protect itself, your body shuts down non-essential functions, prepares to endure an impending and unavoidable torture like a weathering storm, pushing through a starving winter or walking for miles with an injury. Your pain tolerance goes up. You put on weight more easily to conserve calories. Unnecessary movement like exercise feels bad. You become less social. You have trouble expressing emotion, which might get in the way of survival. Your libido tanks. You get sick more easily. All of this occurs to give you the best chance to survive something you can't escape from. You are in freeze. Anyone who has worked in the game development knows this state, regardless of the name they use for it. So this system, essentially, polyvagal theory essentially posits that we've got these three kind of systems, right? We've got sympathetic, we've got ventral vagal, and we've got dorsal vagal. Now, the interesting thing is that it turns out that this is sort of a simplistic approach to it. Now, I think this is what essentially happens. So, like, I'm seeing this a lot with neuroscience, especially, where what tends to happen is people have these experiences, okay? So, like, I have this experience at work, and let's just talk a little bit about what this experience is like, right? So, I have this experience where I get sympathetically activated. I get pissed off in a meeting, okay? And I can't do anything about it. So I'm powerless to do anything about it. And then I become hopeless, right? And so what people sort of discovered is they're like, this is my experience of life. And then what happens is someone reads a little bit of neuroscience, and then they sort of realize, okay, we have good evidence that the sympathetic nervous system is real. We have good evidence that the parasympathetic nervous system is real. And then someone sort of, posits, they say, okay, well, like now what I'm kind of noticing is that we can divide the parasympathetic nervous system into ventral and dorsal. And this sort of explains the fight or flight. This explains essentially like hopelessness and freeze. And this sort of explains peace, calm, chill, relaxed, etc. So someone comes up with this kind of idea. And it turns out that like this, and people really gravitate towards this idea, including clinicians. So people have sort of posited that the dorsal vagal system is really responsible for a lot of the changes in trauma. So if y'all have been longtime watchers of the stream, you know that we've reviewed papers that look at catatonia. So catatonia is a like freezing response, essentially, that's like physiologically and neurologically mediated that we sometimes see in mental illnesses. We've even reviewed papers on stream about the neurophysiology of catatonia and where it comes from, essentially the freeze response and how that's a survival mechanism. And people will put together these theories. And then what happens is, like, since the theory seems to mirror what we experience, we start to think that this is neurologically mediated, right? We start to think this is real. Unfortunately, this is the kind of thing where it's sort of junk science. Now, I don't mean this as an indictment of the person. I think that this person must have found this thing, but this is essentially what you see with people who are like over-interpreting neuroscience. And this is something that we kind of see a lot, like with complicated science that's applied in non-complicated situations. So what do I mean by that? So we're seeing, I think, a lot of junk neuroscience nowadays. And I'm going to just go on a quick aside for this. I'm not indicting this person. This person's experience is 100% accurate. I think physiologically, it's even physiologically mediated. It's just not mediated the way that they think it is. So we're going to talk about what's actually going on physiologically in a second. But let's just take a quick look at polyvagal theory. So this is a Wikipedia article, right? So like take that with a grain of salt. There's evidence that shows that Wikipedia is actually like one of the most correct sources of information. I personally use Wikipedia a lot. But I tend to read a lot of primary literature as well. So I may read the Wikipedia article, but then I'll usually read somewhere between 5 and 15 scientifically peer-reviewed papers on any topic. So this is like essentially what the Wikipedia article sort of demonstrates is it talks about where polyvagal theory came from. And it essentially sort of, it is popular amongst some clinical practitioners and patients, but is not endorsed by current social neuroscience, which I think is absolutely correct. So the reason that this is even endorsed by some clinical practitioners is because it's so functionally useful. It really mirrors our experience. It's a scientific theory that appears to describe very well what we experience. The problem is that it's not actually correct. So let's kind of like go a little bit more in depth. So let's take a look at an actual paper. So freeze for action neurobiological mechanisms in animal and human freezing. So this is like looking at the freezing response and where this comes from. And the key thing here is that as we look into the freeze response in human beings, we start to see that depends on the amygdala projections from the brain stem. Recent neuroimaging studies in humans have indicated that similar regions may be involved. In addition, flexibly shifting between freezing and active defense modes is critical for adequate stress coping and relies on fronto-amygdala connections. The key thing here to understand is that the brain is not reducible to a particular neuron. So what we're sort of discovering about the brain is that we have circuits of interaction between things. I almost think about the brain as like the regions of the brain are like an alphabet. And the phenomenon that we see are combinations of activity between the brain, our physiological system, and other systems in our body. So it's like, you can have some frontal involvement, you can have some amygdala involvement, you can have some dorsal ventral involvement. Dorsal ventral involvement, by the way, really governs a lot of like stomach, GI, digestion sort of stuff. That's neurologically like what it innervates. So if you follow the dorsal vagal nerve, what it'll do is connect to a bunch of stuff in your gut. And so what tends to happen is like, but the problem is that science is complex, right? So if you look at like science, like, there's, biology is complex, physiology is complex, neuroscience is complex, and it's hard to understand. Like you can study the brain your entire life and like still not understand how things work, because the truth is we really don't know much about how things work. And then from neuroscience, we get things like, cognitive neuroscience. And then what we get is psychology, right? And then what we get is like even things like trauma or workplace dynamics. And what people will do is they'll see something, and then over here you have your experience of workplace. And so what's really tempting to do is to take this experience and try to say this is real because of this, right? Oh, like look at there's neuroscience support of this. This is actually how it works in the brain. Whereas that's like a gross oversimplification. Another example of where we see this kind of stuff is in like quantum mysticism, right? Which like is stuff that I've dabbled in myself. Like I've read a lot of stuff about quantum mysticism, but this is sort of a situation where there's kind of a spiritual concept down here. And then there's like quantum mechanics up here, which very few people understand. And then what happens is people will draw some kind of like connection. Now, I'm not saying that this person is that, it's not this egregious as quantum mysticism. But my point is that this is a theory, like dorsal vagal theory is essentially like an oversimplification and or relatively incorrect from a scientific perspective. The interesting thing is that a lot of clinicians will still use it because it helps people understand their experience in a very validating way. So now, what I'd like to do is share a little bit about physiologically what's actually going on, okay? So let's talk about some of these features which this person is experiencing. So let's talk about, as a last resort to protect itself, your body shuts down non-essential functions, right? So pain tolerance goes up. Put on more weight to conserve calories. Feel lazy, unnecessary movement. Become less social. And trouble expressing emotion. Okay? Libido tanks. Immune system dysfunction. And so what people will sort of do is they'll and then they ascribe this to freeze. Thing is, physiologically, that's not really accurate. Okay? So let's look at some of these things. And essentially what we've got here.
Hey, they can't see your iPad.
What?
It's on the Wikipedia article. You gotta switch to the iPad.
It's on the Wikipedia article. You guys can't see this? Now, yeah, I know. I was reading. Okay. All right. So these are not this freeze system because that's not really what the dorsal parasympathetic nervous system does. These are really prolonged cortisol. So the key thing that's missing from this graph is a temporal component. So how long you are in the sympathetic nervous system matters. So if you are in the sympathetic nervous system for a brief period of time, you're totally fine. If you're in the sympathetic nervous system for a long period of time, then your body starts to screw up. So there's a dimension here where I don't think the right answer is, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and then dorsal parasympathetic. This would be ventral. This isn't correct. What it is the balance between symp and parasymp. Okay? And then especially the duration of activity between each of these things. Okay? So let's just go through some of these things. So you put on more weight. This is something we've explained on stream before. So this is what cortisol does to your body, okay? So when I'm in a stressful situation, my body releases cortisol. There's something called the psychoneuroimmunologic axis. So when I'm mentally stressed, I release CRH, which releases ACTH, which releases cortisol. And what cortisol does is increase our blood sugar. Now, why does it increase our blood sugar? Because when we're in a stressful situation, we need a lot of energy available for our limbs so that we can fight or flight, right? Like if I see a tiger and I want to trek 6 miles away so that I can go to sleep tonight, be nowhere near the tiger, I need a constant stream of energy for my muscles. Now, here's the challenge. That's what the evolutionary system was designed for. The problem is that when it's crunch time at my work and I'm stressed out and my cortisol level is high, it increases my blood sugar, but I don't burn like 1,000 calories by walking 6 miles. I just sit there in my chair. Now I have a high level of blood sugar. I'm not burning it, and then my body gets confused. What does blood sugar trigger in the body? What senses our level of blood sugar? Our pancreas. When our pancreas finds a high level of blood sugar, it secretes insulin. When we secrete insulin, this causes fat buildup and weight gain. And by the way, this blood sugar comes from fat and muscle, by the way. So even if you look at a cortisol tumor, what you'll see is like this muscle wasting peripherally with like a big pot belly and even something called buffalo hump. So this is just an example of like people love this kind of thing because it's sort of like, oh, this makes perfect sense. This is what's going on with you. It's just not physiologically and neuroscientifically, it's more complicated than that. There's value to this. I'm not saying that this person is dumb or anything like that. And I think it's actually incredibly important. It's just this particular system appeals to people, but isn't quite as accurate. Now, why is that important? It's because if you want to fix this, but from a physiologic perspective, if the model you're working on is not accurate, then you're going to sort of be shooting yourself in the foot because you're trying to base things on a model that's like not scientifically accurate. Okay? So I don't fault this person for using this because the person's a developer, right? It's sort of like me as a psychiatrist. If I say like, oh, like here's how programming works, like, oh, like it's almost like the neuroscience equivalent of if you're a developer and someone has approached you and they're like, hey, I have this great idea for an app. All you need to do is this, this, or this. Can you program it for me? You'll get, let's start a company together. I'll give you 30% equity to program it. And like, this is how it's going to work. And that's based on like my novice understanding of concepts that I've read online. Like, oh, I have this great idea for a blockchain-based mod for Dota 2 and League of Legends. It's going to be a crossover between LoL and Dota 2. All I'm going to need you to do is build the APIs. The code is actually already in there from Valve and Riot. I just need you to build the APIs. If you build the APIs and we put it on blockchain and we fuel it by Ether, we can kind of put it all together and like, this is how it works. Look, I have this beautiful infographic about this, right? So it's like, there may be some truth in there, right? Like, there may be conceptually like some right things, but that's not actually how it works. And we can't really blame the person who says that because they're not formally trained in this stuff, right? They're gonna look at things that sort of make sense to them and mirror their experience and their understanding, and they're gonna come to you with as a developer. So we see this a lot, especially like when I talk about junk neuroscience, it's because neuroscience is progressing rapidly. But there are a lot of people who are coming up with these like practical neuroscience applications. I mean, we fall into this as well, right? So I think ours is a little bit more scientifically valid, but we absolutely do this kind of stuff where people are trying to make applications out of our understanding of neuroscience. And this is sort of what you end up with. And so why is this important? Because if you want to fix this, you have to understand physiologically what's going on, okay? So these things I think are really related to chronic stress as opposed to dorsal recruitment. And so, for example, even things like immune system dysfunction. So cortisol causes demarginalization of white blood cells. So what does that mean? So demarginalization of white blood cells means that we have a bunch of white blood cells that are the soldiers of the immune system, and we've got a bunch of them on standby. And when cortisol activates, what it does is it's like we're sounding the alarm, and literally it increases white blood cells in our bloodstream, demarginalizes them and increases their number by about 50%. So we like ramp up our immune system activity by about 50%. Now, the tricky thing is that when we ramp up immune system activity, it can also cause, now we've got a bunch of these white blood cells, which were originally designed to fight off infection. So the reason that we've evolved this is because if I see a tiger and my cortisol level goes high and I get scratched by the tiger, there's going to be a bunch of bacteria in there, and we want our white blood cells to be like there in our bloodstream the moment we get scratched or bit or whatever, so we can fight off that infection. Now the problem is if you're a dev and you're stressed out and your cortisol level is high, because this person does a very good job of this, by the way, where they talk about essentially like the way we've evolved is not for our current society. So that's an excellent point that this person raises here. But when we're stressed out, we have high levels of white blood cell activity, but no infection to fight. What does that result in? Increased autoimmune disease. Because now we've got all these white blood cells with itchy trigger fingers. What do I need to fight? What do I need to fight? What do I need to fight? And there's nothing to fight. But they're itchy, so they start attacking like other stuff in our body. So we see things like increases in eczema, arthritis, joint pain. We're in a pro-inflammatory state, which results in malaise. I don't feel like doing anything. Right? So like all of these things, feeling lazy. Pain tolerance is a little bit, that gets even more complicated from a neuroscience perspective. You know, our libido tanks, absolutely. These are like long-term cortisol results in a reduction in libido. So I would say that if you look at this physiologically, to me anyway, and this is probably an oversimplification as well, because like, I'm not a neurophysiologist, I'm a psychiatrist. So like, do I understand this stuff? Sure. Do I understand it pretty well? I'm pretty sure that what I'm saying is like well-founded by science, but it's even more complicated. This is an oversimplification of how our immune system works, okay? So this is where I don't think this is the freeze response. This isn't a dorsovagal thing. This is actually a prolonged stress response. So when we're in a sympathetic activation for a prolonged period of time, our body develops some kind of tolerance to it, and then it kind of we get all these kind of weird effects. The other thing to talk a little bit about, just kind of debunking this, is this kind of thing. So it makes the ventral vagal seem like the perfect thing. And this is the other thing that I tend to see in science that tends to be simplified, is there's a bad part of our body and there's a good part of our body, right? Like why on earth would I ever want the dorsal vagal to be activated? Don't I always want the ventral vagal to be activated? Right? Like it's like, oh, this is bad and this is good. And this is what happens when we reduce signs. We say like, this is bad and this is good, right? And that's where like, it's not really like that. So for example, what we really want here, if you want curiosity, openness, and mindfulness, okay, arguably this is something I really understand. So, right, so the mindfulness, like the neuroscience of mindfulness and engagement and curiosity, these are things that, in my opinion, are achieved between a balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. So, here is stress. Here's our stress level. Here's our productivity. What do y'all think this curve looks like? It looks like this. So, if I give you 1,000 arithmetic worksheets that are just adding numbers between 1 and 10. So it's like 2 plus 2, 2 plus 5, 7 plus 2, 7 plus 4, 8 plus 1, 9 plus 2. If I give you 1,000 worksheets and I tell you, do these 1,000 worksheets, it's the easiest task in the world. You can do it. How productive are you going to be? Down here. Okay? I tell you, prepare a lecture on neuroscience stress for developers, right? And depending on what your background is, you may feel incapable of doing that. It feels too hard. This is where you're going to be. This is where we feel overwhelmed. This is where we feel bored. Neither one leads to an optimal level of productivity. If we want optimal productivity, we want to be in this zone. And this is actually where the flow state exists. So you want to be mentally engaged, right? You don't want to be bored. You don't want to be overwhelmed. You need some level of stress. So we see this in esports as well, where like you get the best performance when people have a certain amount of stress. Not too stressed, not too chill. Because if I'm like, oh, this game is easy, no big deal, I'm going to throw. And if like, oh my God, I'm playing against the best team in the world, there's no way I stand a chance, I'm going to get crushed. Oh my God, these guys are going to destroy me. There's nothing I can do. That's over here. Where do you want to be? You want to be right in the middle. What's the attitude you want to have? I can win this game, but it's going to take everything that I've got. Let's go, baby. They're going to give it the best that they've got. I'm going to give it the best that I've got. We'll see who ends up on top. I'm ready. That's the attitude you want. Right? So in terms of this engagement, curiosity, and even mindfulness. So this is the other thing to understand about mindfulness. Everyone thinks, poorly understood in the West, everyone thinks that mindfulness is parasympathetic activity, is vagal nerve activity. This is actually incorrect. So if we look at the sympathetic side, and if we look at the parasympathetic side, why do we believe that meditation sits over here? It is because we as a society sit over here. We are way too stressed out. And so when we meditate, it's moving us in this direction. So we conclude that meditation is a relaxing activity. Let me explain something to y'all. If you do Tumo meditation, it is not relaxing. If you do things like holotropic breath work, it is not relaxing. If you do things like Kundalini Shakti-oriented practices, it is not relaxing. They're meditation practices that move you in this direction. These are meditation practices that can induce psychosis when done poorly, can induce mania when done poorly. These are practices that allow you to survive hypothermia. And this is what, the Wim Hof method is Tumo, right? It's not really his method. He learned it from Nepalese monks. So there are meditation practices that actually move you in both directions. The reason that we all assume that meditation is a relaxing practice is because as a society, that seems to be what people benefit from the most. But when I have a patient who is schizophrenic or depressed, it depends on what they're experiencing from a schizophrenia standpoint, I will actually teach them these kinds of practices. It doesn't result in psychosis. I don't teach those kinds. But we'll actually teach you activating practices. The other thing is Nadi Shuddhi meditation, alternate nostril breathing, is great because it actually moves you towards here. So if you are tired, it'll wake you up. If you're stressed, it'll calm you down. So generally speaking, meditation is going to move you towards this center area. Okay? All right? Does that make sense? So once again, so let's kind of go back to this for a second. So now we've talked a little bit about the science. Now, hopefully I'm not coming across as saying, oh, this person's that's not really what I mean to say. What I think is going on here is that this person has found a scientific basis for their experience. Now, based on my background, I think that this is sort of not really a correct way to look at it, but the pieces of this are all correct. The way that they're organized are not correct. They're oversimplifications. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But this is still an incredibly useful thing to look at because it helps us understand what the experience of developers are. Because if this resonates with you, even if it's scientifically incorrect, your experience is legitimate, right? Just because the details of what's going on, whether it's the freeze response, dorsovagal, or cortisol, that's a prolonged cortisol, that sort of doesn't matter too much. I mean, it matters in a sense, but we'll get to that. The key thing is that this graphic sort of captures and lends credibility to the idea that this is not all in your head and that this is physiologically mediated, which is absolutely correct. It just has to be oversimplified. Okay? So now let's go onto the article a little bit more. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there are very specific things that happen to the body when you're trapped in a situation that's hurting you. It's a physiological state, not just a mental one. 100% agree. But more importantly, if you follow the polyvagal chart above, you can see that in order to enter the freeze state, you need to encounter a threat your body tells you to kill or run from, and then not kill it or run from it. In other words, you must be trapped and unable to do something about it. This is where I think we have to be a little bit careful. Okay, so I'm gonna continue reading the article, and then I'm gonna share my perspective on why this is potentially a slightly dangerous approach. So, so then this person kind of like, to be clear, I'm not advocating for fleeing into the forest or hurling the nearest ergonomic chair at your crunch-loving boss. But with the concept of how we end up with freeze in mind, what else can we learn from the chart? To get back to humanity after entering a freezing state, you must pass back through fight or flight. Anyone who's designed a combat system can probably see where this is going. Your body primed itself for a fight that never came and loaded a round into the chamber ready to fire. You added a stack of a berserker buff and then never consumed it to clear your state. When you enter the freeze state, instead of fight or flighting, the chemicals your brain dumped into itself and your body didn't just dissipate or disappear. And in order to return to normal, you're going to have to expend them one way or another. So this, I think, is basically scientifically incorrect. Okay, so let's just explore this. I think this person wrote a really good article, but I just wanted to share that this is just not correct based on my experience. So let's just use adrenaline, for example. If your body secretes adrenaline and you don't fight anyone, what happens to the adrenaline? Does it just float around? No. It gets broken down. It gets metabolized, right? So things within our body have a half-life. They exist for a certain amount of time, and then our body literally clears chemicals from our bloodstream. This is why you can't drink 5 beers today and be drunk for the rest of your life, because our body metabolizes things. Our body is in the constant state of clearing debuffs. So why does it feel, so this is the important thing, just because this person is wrong about the physiology does not mean that they are wrong about the experience of it. So why does this person feel like the buff never gets cleared? Well, that actually has to do with more psychological principles. It has to do with ongoing sources of stress. So why does it feel like we have to clean these debuffs? So when we go through a stressful period, if this is a chronic state of stress, like a work environment, the issue isn't that we have to cleanse the berserker buff or we need to expend it. The issue is that every day we get 1 stack of the berserker buff. right? Because you're going in to see that boss every single day. Like, what does this person want to do? Wants to fling chairs at their boss. They go in every single day. Their stress system activates, right? And if y'all have been in a stressful environment, like, you know what it's like to walk into the doors of your office. You know what it's like to walk into the classroom where your professor picks on you. You know exactly what's going on. You're not hanging on to a berserker buff from a week ago when your professor picked on you. Every time you enter that classroom, every time you enter that building, every time you sit down in a meeting with your toxic boss, your sympathetic nervous system activates again, dumps cortisol into your body, dumps adrenaline into your body. These get metabolized over time, right? But then we're exposing ourselves to the same chronic stress. Okay? So, unfortunately, there is no universal guaranteed way to return to normal after hitting that freeze point. This, too, I sort of disagree with, and that's what we're going to talk about. Because in our experience, there may not be a universal guaranteed way, right? But there are consistently helpful, comprehensive ways to dealing with this situation. And that's like how science works, right? There's no universal guaranteed way to prevent COVID. There's no universal guaranteed way to prevent colon cancer or treat colon cancer. There's no universal guaranteed way to treat pneumonia. And at the same time, based on this thing that we call science, we can play to the odds and help 90% of people, 95, 99% of people not die from COVID. We can lower cholesterol levels, reduce the likelihood of an MI. We can do high fiber diets plus colonoscopies starting at the age of 50 to prevent colon cancer or catch colon cancer when it is in a precancerous polyp state and remove it. It looks different for everyone. Disagree. This is where the whole point here is that there is physiology that is shared. There are experiences that are shared. And if these things are physiologic, scientific, and shared, that means that there may be a common road that we can all use. And this is what we found working with hundreds of developers, is that there are common things that we can do, and we're going to get to those in just a second, okay? So this is where the person does actually, I think, a really good job, because they talk about a lot of the different things that could do. It could be trauma therapy. For others, it could be quitting a job. It could be moving, right? Removing yourself from the stressful environment, processing the trauma, processing what it's like to go into that environment day in and day out, both excellent options. Taking a break, listening to an emotional piece of music, like you may need physical activity, right? So like if we think about it, what do all these things do? They all have physiologic effects. So if I have a high cortisol level and I have a high level of blood sugar going through my body and I start exercising, what's that going to do? It's going to reduce my inflammatory state. It's going to reduce my blood sugar. It's going to do all kinds of physiologic things that directly counter this business up here, right? So like exercise is going to be very good for this. Fantastic. And then there's psychological impacts as well, because the cortisol and adrenaline are not just going to be from walking in the doors. They're going to be generated from up here. When I sit down into a meeting, what do I think? As I dread every meeting, as I hate going into work every day, can I change those thoughts? And if I change those thoughts, if I process those emotions, can I approach work with a different attitude or a different mindset? If I can cultivate the right kind of mindset, will it reduce my cortisol level? Absolutely. Okay? So, but be warned, it's not enough to merely carry out these actions, especially if you're still dissociated or disconnected. You must enter the state where your body screams fight and burn the fuel it filled you with. That may be this person's experience. I don't know if I entirely agree with that. So to put it another way, if you've been traumatized by something and you're in the freeze state from complex PTSD, I don't know that you need to re-enter a fight state, and I don't know exactly what that means, but I just don't, this kind of confuses me. So I don't agree. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just I don't fully understand where this person is coming from. Then they talk a little bit about trauma complicates matters, 100% agree, right? For some, the exhaustion of continuous fight or flight response can also leave you in a state of perpetual freeze. Sort of true, right? That's what we talked about. So this person is kind of like, I agree with this person that chronic stress creates this kind of thing. It can even end up in PTSD. So and now I think we get to the meat of it. The real dark industry secret of this article is that many of us just end up living in these states, not knowing what they are and not understanding why 2 weeks of vacation doesn't help. 100% agree. This is why we're sharing the article, right? Because this is 100% correct. That developers today are living in work states that they do not understand. They don't understand where it comes from, what causes it, or how to get out of it. This we've seen time and time and time again. We take vacations, we move jobs, but because the underlying, it carries with us, right? The underlying issue hasn't been addressed. The pain is quite literally stored in our bodies chemically, and we lived in a trap cycle where we can never get back to that safe, healthy ventral vagal state. Once again, sentiment is correct, science not so much, right? So this is where we're going to talk a little bit about. So first off, it is possible to heal. It won't just magically happen. No, there's no amount of set PTO or recovery time that will guarantee healing. But there is a minimum amount of time required to heal. That time frame will be different for everyone, but you have to do the work. Get help, be active in your own recovery. Your friends are good support. A trauma therapist is better, one that knows the industry better again. So once again, generally agree with the sentiment here, but this is where I do think that there is a consistent formula you can participate in to get out of this situation. That PTO is not going to fix the problem because once again, remember, every time you walk into the doors, your cortisol level is going to go up. That's why PTO is not going to fix the problem, right? So trauma therapists may help you metabolize some of those emotions. Talking with friends and stuff may help too. We'll talk a little bit about how to do that in a second. You may need to redefine your relationship with work. 100% agree. The question is how, right? So this is the other thing. Is on the internet, you'll see a ton of articles like this, right? Where they talk about what's wrong. How many words do we have about what's wrong? We have so many words about what's wrong. And then how many words do we have about how to fix it? Right? How to prevent it. They talk a little bit about, okay, so if you're an executive, you need to understand that this is probably happening to someone who works for you right now. Your corporate values won't protect them. Empowering language and concepts can be easily weaponized against vulnerable employees. Convincing yourself that your space is safe will prevent you from seeing when it's not. Ideas don't protect anyone, only action can do that. You have to mitigate toxicity with robust process, with anonymous reporting and feedback, with project management designed to combat crunch, with product management designed to prevent thrash. So this is where we really start to disagree. So this is what's kind of weird, okay? Now, there's no way around this, and since I know that some people will be reading to say, but surely not here, we're a family. Let me disabuse you of the notion that work as family is a good thing. Those implied social and emotional obligations often further freeze people who need to fight or flee. This too, I know it's kind of weird, I somewhat disagree with. So I've been in two kinds of work environments. One where work sort of feels like family and I feel like people have my back and I love it. It's fantastic. So family, just like any other family can be toxic, abusive in a place where people take advantage of each other, or it can be a place where people have each other's back, where personal relationships matter more than the work. I've seen families in which both of these things are options. I've seen work situations in which both of these places are options. So I'll give you guys just a simple example from my own work. So I trained at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. As a second-year resident, I had a supervisor who said that I can't supervise you because what you're doing is not therapy. See, she essentially fired me as a student, right? This, to my knowledge, is the only time I'd ever heard of that this happened, where someone says, I can't teach you. She was assigned to me to teach me, and she said, I can't teach you. I can't supervise you. So I went to my program director, or she went to my program director, and like my program director, to this day, I treat as family. Because they had my back in that moment. It wasn't about keeping egos happy or things like that. They like really did an awesome job of trying to understand, okay, what's going on here? They didn't assume that I was doing bad. They didn't assume that this person was toxic. They didn't assume I was lazy. They tried to understand the situation. Turned out that the way that I do therapy involves a lot of mindfulness-oriented stuff, which makes it not therapy. And so what they did is find someone who was a mindfulness researcher to be my supervisor, who better understood what I was doing, better understood that this is not traditional therapy. It can arguably even be called not therapy. And like, that was so awesome, right? That this person like took the extra time, didn't just assign me to a random person, went out of their way to understand what my challenge was, I was someone who was being like basically fired, right, by a superior. Like how many bosses do you have that when your direct report is like, yeah, I'm going to fire this employee, and then like the CEO comes in and is like, hey, let's take a look at the situation and see if we can make this work somehow. Help me understand what your problem with this employee is. Let me talk to the employee. Let's see if there's some way we can make this work. Like that's not common, but it absolutely happens in workplaces. There are other workplaces where same residency programs where the CEO, the program director, tries to take advantage of doesn't stand up for their residents and lets them get chewed up. Oh, there's shitty work to do? Assign it to the resident. I don't have their back. So both can exist. Now, here's the key thing. Now, if you want to know how we help developers, this is how we help developers. Let me give you some clear, direct questions you can ask yourself about the place you work. Is it possible for employees to raise issues they have without any risk to themselves, even socially? I want you all to think about this question. How many workplaces do you think exist where the answer to this question is yes? Chances are very few. So this is where someone comes to the conclusion. The problem here is that the workplace is not safe. The problem here is that employees cannot raise issues they have without any risk to themselves. The feedback needs to be anonymous. Completely disagree. Here's the reason why. Is it possible for employees to raise issues they have without any risk to themselves? Well, this is where I'd say it depends on how you raise the issue. This is the problem. This is how we help people, by helping people recognize that if you go up to your boss and you say, hey, fucker, you're running a toxic work environment. Fuck you, bitch. This needs to change. Do you think that's going to have repercussions? If that has repercussions, are you advocating that this is a bad workplace? Right? No. This is where you as an employee, and this is what we see with developers, don't tend to be the best at interpersonal communication. So they wind up in situations where they don't know how to deliver good feedback. So we literally had a situation yesterday precisely with this problem. How do you talk to a micromanaging boss? Right? So you can say, hey, boss, you micromanage all of us. It drives us all insane. You need to stop. I'm quitting. Or you go to the boss and you say, hey, I'm struggling to be like independent and demonstrate initiative, because when I do something that's like, when I try to be like independent and demonstrate initiative, you tend to like redo everything and kind of micromanage. So I'm struggling to understand, do you want me to do things exactly the way that you're telling me to do them? Or do you want me to be a little bit more independent and sort of do things my way and like work outside of the box? Which one do you want? Completely different. I'm struggling to demonstrate initiative and independence working under you. Help me understand how I can do that better, or whether I should stop trying. And when you go to your boss like that, when you communicate feedback in a productive way, it completely transforms the conversation. We've had situations where people will be like, I can't work with this person, I'm gonna quit, because they don't know how to deliver feedback. Swear to God, we've had situations. We help this person understand what they're feeling, understand their frustration, understand their experience, role play with them to develop how to talk to their boss, where the end result, they go and they talk to their boss, they do it in a non-judgmental manner, they offer like, constructive feedback, and what ends up happening, this person doesn't even quit. This person ends up getting promoted. Boss changes their behavior. Now they're managing a team. Because the boss realizes, oh crap, like this is, thank you so much for like sharing this with me. I had no idea that I was having this impact on the employees. So how does the company react when workers raise issues? So this is another thing that like, this is a good question, right? Because the company may have a particular philosophy. But like, this is where, like there's a lot of stuff here which, and this is what happens when you operate from a space, and if we think about the emotional tone of this article, how do you imagine this person is feeling? They're up here, helpless, depression, numbness. There's a lack of agency, okay? When there's a lack of agency, you end up with deterministic binary questions that are very hard to answer in the right way. Y'all get that? Like the mind is operating from a place of despair. And when the mind operates from a place of despair, then it's like the system you're creating is going to be rigged against you. There's a lot of good stuff in here, but the key thing here is that this is all, what does the company do? It's separating out the company from the employee. It's assuming that the employee has no capacity to influence how the company responds. And when you surrender that agency as an employee, you may say, oh, but I can't do anything. They're the ones with all the power. Completely disagree. Do they have way more power than you do? Absolutely. But you have some power. You absolutely have some power. And when you start to exercise that power, you will discover one of two things. One is a situation in which your manager understands that, recognizes that, appreciates that, and then you will enrich your entire workplace. You will enrich your work experience. You will make your manager happy, and it's going to be amazing. This is what it's like to work on a team where everyone is aligned. Or the manager will be egotistical, despite your best efforts to offer constructive feedback in a non-judgmental and non-critical way. They're going to take it personally. They're going to start playing games. They're going to feel threatened, all this kind of crap, and then you should absolutely leave. We help developers do that too. Right? But what we've seen, what's missing, is that as people, just to kind of summarize, as people work in these environments where they end up in these states of despair, they start to think about like, I gotta quit, or like this workplace is toxic or whatever. And it could be, right? We're not saying it isn't. But the thing is, even in a toxic workplace, there are things that you can do. Like if you have one coworker who's bullying you, for example, or a coworker who's sexually harassing you, there are ways that you can navigate that. Some companies are going to take it seriously. Other companies with cube crawls are not. Right? So we're not saying that every company is perfect. We're not saying that you shouldn't leave. But the key thing is that if you are surrendering your agency, which also makes sense because you've been in this situation, no one ever taught you how chronic stress works. No one ever taught you what this is doing to your brain and your mind. You're carrying around all this emotional like crap, which, by the way, one last thing to point out, if you guys did not know this, a lot of this stuff is in Dr. K's guide if you want to understand how this works. So a lot of these are binary questions. Adrenaline makes the mind think in binary ways. So the more stressed you are, the less nuance you're able to perceive. You just see binary solutions, quit or stay, quit or stay, quit or stay. Right? So this whole post is coming from a place of emotional despair, numbness, etc. Right? This is not a post that's written out of curiosity and openness and joy and being in the present. I don't blame the person. I think that's what makes it a good post, because this captures so authentically the experience of so many developers we've worked with. But the truth is there are all kinds of things that you can do, right? You can understand how this affects you physiologically. You can understand how to set limits with people. So for example, a lot of this stuff, how often does unplanned work occur? How do your processes and prioritization handle that found work? Do you bake additional time into your project planning for allowing things not to go as planned? So how often do employees work outside of business hours? How do you track it? These kinds of things are workable. These things are affectable by the employee. So we'll also teach employees how to set good boundaries, which is bizarre, right? Because no one teaches us how to set boundaries. Even with work colleagues. You may think, but I can't set boundaries. Oh, yes, you can. I'll be fired. Well, maybe, but then you probably don't want to work there. So there's a lot of skills that we can gain in terms of in terms of EQ stuff. So understanding what you feel, processing that despair, like changing your mindset, just like this person says. Redefining your relationship with work. So another interesting case I'll tell you. So I had this one person come in, was afraid that they were going to be fired. Really bad anxiety. They were having panic attacks, vomiting, all this kind of stuff because they were afraid they were going to be fired. Oh my God, I'm going to be fired. I'm going to be fired. I'm going to be fired. Work with them for 8 months. Deal with the anxiety, deal with the panic attacks. They're not so worried about being fired anymore. Okay, what is it? Why are you afraid that you're being fired? Well, the reason I'm afraid I'm being fired is because I'm a team player and everyone else is out for themselves. And so they take credit for my work. And I just don't, I'm not winning. Everyone else is getting accolades. I'm not getting accolades. And so I'm always at the bottom of the pack because I share credit with other people and other people don't share credit with me. This is why I'm going to be fired. I don't want to be fired. 8 months later, what do you think happens? 3 months to fix the panic attacks. 3 months to start working well. 3 months later, what do you think this person does? Do they get fired? They fucking quit. Because they're like, you know what? I don't even want to work here. I want to work in a place where people support each other. That's what I do. I don't want to compromise myself to becoming a backstabbing asshole. Instead, I'm going to start a company, which is what they did, that's like team-oriented. That's what they did. So from terrified you're losing your job to saying, I'm moving on because this is not the right workspace for me. Absolutely possible. But you have to stop thinking in a binary way. You have to start considering open-mindedness, right? Curiosity, creative solutions. That's not going to happen from this mindset. How do you get there? You emotionally process what you've been through. Coaches will ask you questions. You'll start to understand what your work situation is like. And then as you start to work through that stuff, a lot of these questions will become answerable, but you'll start to have agency because you can have a conversation with your boss and I didn't get fired. Things can actually change. Maybe they will change. Maybe they won't. Maybe you're going to have to moderate your expectations. Not like one conversation is going to change someone's personality. Right? Absolutely possible. And this is the kind of thing where like, even if, how often do employees work outside of standard business hours? So if you routinely work out of standard business hours, like how do you have a conversation about that? So we've like helped people with that. It's sort of like going to your boss and saying, hey, so I'm just curious, like for the past 4 weeks, this has been crunch time and I've been working 100 hours a week. What can I expect going forward? You can just ask a question like that. I'm trying to figure out like, I had to cancel a bunch of stuff and I'm just trying to figure out, should I assume that this is the norm? And this is where you're not saying it's bad. You're not saying it's good. You're not saying it shouldn't be like this. You're not indicting anyone. You're going to your boss and you're saying like, I just need to know what to plan for. I'm trying to organize like stuff after work. And if this is what we're going to be dealing with, that's okay. I just need to understand that. So you can just ask transparently. And then like you can like, depending on how your relationship is with your boss, you can also ask like non-judgmental questions, right? You could say like, well, what do you think about that? So if we're going to be working 100 hours a week for the next 6 months, like, what do you think about that? Because I can guarantee this is the other thing is that people assume that bosses like that kind of stuff. Like, do you think that your boss likes working 100 hours a week? And this is where the boss will say something, because we've been through this before. Boss is like, yeah, like, I don't like it either. I know it's hard on you guys, but that's just the way the industry is. There's nothing we can do. Because guess where the boss is? Boom, 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 boom. There's nothing we can do. Right? And so now imagine if you're the employee who comes to them and says, hey, I have something that I think could help. Would you be willing to consider it? And the boss is like, no, it's impossible. Well, then you're in the wrong place. Nothing you can do. But oftentimes what the boss is going to say, yeah, please tell me. If you've got a solution, like, what do you think we should do? I think we should do A, B, or C. Let's try this. Can we pilot it for like 4 weeks? And then the boss is like, sure, let's give it a shot. And if it works, if productivity doesn't go down, all this other kind of stuff, oh my goodness. And this is what I learned at GDC. So we talked to devs at like AAA game studios where like the team leaders, the senior lead designers know that burning out your employees is not a sustainable solution. They know that. They're all looking for ways to not burn out their employees. They don't like burning people out. Like a lot of the devs in the industry are decent human beings. They're just not equipped or empowered to make changes. They don't understand what they're dealing with. Right? So there's absolutely changes that can be made, 100%. You can change your relationship with people at work if you learn how to communicate better. Oh, there's no way if I learn. No, there's like, I'm telling you, man, like there's a lot can change. Right? This is from someone who's done marriage counseling where someone had an affair. They're tearing each other's throats out. And then you get them in a room and you get them talking. Right? Communication is powerful, incredibly powerful, and it's grossly underdeveloped in the developer industry. Right? And this isn't like, I'm not saying this in terms of like temperamentally, oh, they're like computer nerds, so they don't know how to talk to humans. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying if you look at the industry, That's not what it emphasizes. That's not what you get taught, right? So it's nothing about like, oh, you like computers, so you're socially inept. That's stupid, outdated thinking. Quite the opposite. Super high EQs. The whole reason that this stuff is working is because some of these people are such naturally talented, high EQ people that without any formal training, they're able to manage teams. They have so much raw talent in EQ that you just teach them some tools and it's like amazing what they're capable of. Seeing the same thing with esports. Because what happens in esports is you get one clueless person after another clueless person after another clueless person until you get some combination of a team that no one knows how to communicate that naturally fit together. Do y'all get that? Like that's why people like roster shuffle so much. It's like, oh, we need to change this, we need to change this. Because they have no idea how to fix problems. All they know how to do is replace people until you find the perfect formula. That's what you're looking for, but you don't realize that the piece itself can be shaped. So you don't have to find the perfect piece. You just need to trim the piece, add a little bit here, cut a little bit there, and it'll start to fit together. Just as a quick aside, last bit of data I'll share with y'all. When you teach students social and emotional skills as a class, it increases their grades by 11%. 11%. Think about that. You're moving from an 80 to a 91. In your classes, in mathematics, in biology, by teaching students how to communicate and what they're feeling on the inside. Nuts. Nuts. And we can teach this to devs too. Right? It's nuts. Why do you guys think that places like Harvard Business School charge $40,000 for like a 3-week course on this crap? Because it works, right? Because it really does. When you get to some high levels of performance, teaching someone how to be a better human and a better communicator is ultimately how you increase revenue. That's why they charge for this, because they like money. Why do people pay it? Oh, hey, Chopsky is in chat? Really? For realsies? Hold on. Let's see this. Okay, so Chopsky, first I gotta ask you for feedback. So I loved your post, but I gotta know if I was too harsh on you. Did you feel like I was like calling you, because I was afraid of like debunking some of the scientific stuff, whereas I thought it was fantastic overall. I love the article, but I was afraid, like I didn't know, yeah, so I mean, you know, if you felt like I was harsh or critical, please let me know, and I'm more than happy to apologize. I thought it was a really fantastic article, which is why we featured it. The science is kind of, and that's also that, I mean, you know, clinicians use that stuff too, and presumably they should know better. But there's a functional advantage to those kinds of models, even if they aren't correct, which is what I think what's really important. But I loved it. The article, I got so excited. Someone sent it to me, and I was like, we got to talk about this, because it's such a good characterization of what developers experience. I love it. Yeah, okay. So that's the problem. We fall into the problem of oversimplifying too, right? Because that's what happens when you can't pack an entire PhD in neuroscience into one article. So by definition, what you have to do, the more broad you make your audience, is you have to simplify things. We're going to I'll link the article again. I think it's awesome that devs are even writing about this kind of stuff. Y'all should check it out. Okay. Questions? We've got TikToks to react to. Okay. So Noodlar TY is saying, where's a good place to learn communication skills from your home? So Okay, so a lot of good questions. So that's one place is actually group coaching. So group coaching, you're going to be working on problems, but we're going to teach you some basic tools, and you're going to learn how to listen, interpret, ask questions in a non-judgmental way, learn skills like reflective listening, right? And then we teach you those skills in the first 4 to 6 weeks, and then you're going to use them. We saw someone was in group for like 30 weeks, and they thought it was a great experience. So then you use those skills to dig in. Okay, that's one place. We may actually, there's a communication YouTube video that y'all can also watch that talks about like how to communicate. It is one of our most poorly made and one of our most helpful videos, according to the feedback that I've gotten. Kind of hard to follow, TBH, but for the people who got it, it was like revolutionary. So we got to like redo that at some point because it was sort of like, it wasn't, well, because it's kind of confusing. Okay. So you can check out the communication webinar. The other, yeah. So that's what I'd say. Those are two things. Hold on. Okay, I'm getting how to reverse burnout. So here's the thing to understand about burnout. We actually did a lecture on burnout, I think last week, which y'all hopefully it'll get uploaded at some point. But it goes into the 6 features that cause burnout and how to address them. So I think this blog post is also fantastic because it highlights that work-related problems are not just on the working end. You as a human have an interaction with work. So one of the key things, the reason that burnout is so bad is because the employee thinks it's the employer's problem and the employer thinks it's the employee's problem. And frankly, I think most employers are handling burnout very, very poorly. And the reason for that is because they're saying, oh, like to fix burnout, we need wellness. And so now what we have is a mandatory wellness session before or after work. So you're going to work from 9 to 5, and then you have your mandatory meditation training from 5 to 6. Then the employer is like, oh, wellness is good, meditation is good, and by the way, we're going to get you a subscription to this app. Burnout is fixed. Good job. Good job, HR. Thanks for fixing burnout for our employees. That was easy. What's wrong? Is the mandatory wellness insufficient? Well, here, take some more mandatory wellness. Open wide. We're going to have a 7 a.m. We've gotten feedback that the 5 p.m. wellness session didn't make people wellness enough. So we're going to add a 7 a.m. session before work. So this is why burnout and like wellness is like so toxic for employees. They're actually making the problem worse by creating all this mandatory wellness. So here's the thing. If you go back and watch that lecture, the key thing is that for each of the 6 factors, and these are research-based factors, okay? Originally done by, I think, Christina Maslach and a couple of other researchers. If you look at these 6 factors, there's an employer side and there's an employee side. And this is what I think is kind of missing. Is that what burnout really is it's something that arises out of the interaction between employee and employer. We're talking about employers, but burnout can be in other situations too. Like if you're a streamer and you work for yourself, you can still burn out. But it's a work individual interaction. So solving burnout and reversing burnout involves working on both of those sides. And specifically for each of the 6 factors we offer in that lecture, a solution on the work side and one solution on the individual side. Because sometimes burnout is not caused by your employer, right? Sometimes it's actually caused by you. So we see this a lot with the content creators that we work with, which is the reason they burn out is because they won't let themselves rest. And why don't you let yourself rest? Well, that's because of some kind of emotion that I feel, which I know sounds simplistic, but let me give you all a simple example. So why don't we set boundaries at work? Because I'm afraid that my boss won't like it. I'm afraid that my employees won't like it. I'm afraid that I'll be perceived a particular way. The reason you set boundaries is not because you're going to get fired. It's because you're afraid you're going to get fired. Big difference, right? And so by working on that internal emotion, you can learn to set boundaries a little bit better. Because when, another example, let's say that I hang out with a group of friends on Discord and I'm the routine punching bag. They always make fun of Dr. K because he sucks at Dota, right? And so they always make fun of me, always make fun of me, always make fun of me. And then if I tell people, hey, I want y'all to stop making fun of me, what are they going to do? They're going to make fun of me more. What's the matter, pansy? Can't take it? Lol. So then I'm afraid to like set a boundary with them because they may not play with me anymore. So a lot of like unhealthy boundaries are determined, maintained by internal emotional stuff. If you look at relationships with narcissistic parents, it's the same way. It's really sad, but the reason that, you know, narcissistic and helicopter parents get away with what they get away with is because as a child, you want your parent to love you. You want your parent to approve of you. You want your parent to be proud of you. You don't want them to be mad at you because that's how our brains are wired, right? Like 10 million years ago, there were two sets of parents with two sets of kids. And one child took a paper clip 10 million years ago and stuck it in the electrical socket. And the second child, the other family did the same thing. And in one family, the parent yelled at them and the child listened and wanted the approval of their parent. And that's the child that survived. It's the child that didn't listen, didn't care about the approval of their parent that got into trouble. So evolutionarily, we want the approval of our parents. You'll see this anytime with a kid, right? So if you have like a 1-year-old kid and they meet a stranger, how do they interact? How does a 1-year-old interact with the stranger? They're going to look at their parent. What is my parent doing? Oh, they're hugging them. I guess this person is safe. It's how we're wired. And so a lot of the boundaries that we let these narcissistic parents cross is because of love, because of the desire for approval. It's internal emotional needs. In the workplace, with parents, all kinds of things. There's a lot of internal work you can do. As you do that internal work, you can start to reverse the factors of burnout. You have to start by sort of figuring out, right? I'm going to use the word diagnose, but I don't mean in a clinical sense. You have to determine what the problem is. What's causing the burnout? Which of these 6 factors? Is there an internal thing or an external thing that I can work on? Is this something I need to work on internally, or do I need to set a limit, have a conversation at work? If I need to set a limit or have a conversation at work, can I work with someone who can role play that through with me so that I can feel confident in having that conversation? Because I've never done that before, or when I've done it, I think it's going to end terribly. So you can level up, right? And that's what we try to do. Is if you're not with me, us, you're against us, an adrenaline response? Absolutely. 100%. Right? It's black and white thinking, which can be influenced by adrenaline. There are other things that cause black and white thinking. Okay? Okay. Yeah, maybe you're a misunderstanding, but setting boundaries against someone with power over you, 100%. You can absolutely do that. In fact, you should do that. Right? So I want y'all to put yourselves in the position of power. So like if someone sets a boundary with you, how would you react? Are you just going to say, screw you, you're fired? How dare you? I mean, if you do that, you're going to be an asshole boss. But chances are, as someone who's been an employee, wouldn't you appreciate, like you'd appreciate the ability to set a boundary with a boss? And as a boss, you can appreciate when employees set boundaries with you. Right? So this is, it depends on the boss, absolutely. So I'm not saying that like this is going to work at all companies. Like, I know it sounds kind of weird, but I'd say more than half of companies are actually like good places to work, just based on people that I've talked to. The problem is that sometimes the largest companies, so if you just look at like 1,000 companies, I'd say like 500 plus are probably decent places to work. The problem is that some of the biggest ones are the worst places to work and they employ the most people. So that's like a slightly different approach. But so Crystal Fiction's asking, how can I start to work on weakening, long-standing, deeply rooted, catastrophic thinking that was formed from growing up with a narcissistic BPD mother? It feels so difficult and near impossible to see any changes even 5 years into bringing awareness into it. I'd say go see a therapist. So if you're really talking about working with a narcissistic BPD mother, like therapy is what you need. Okay, let's talk about TikTok. Okay. Okay, so 5 things you don't realize. I don't know. Let's take a look.
5 things you don't realize you're doing because of your high functioning anxiety. You're nice and easy to be around, but you people please too much. You obsess over trivial things that other people probably don't even notice. You're consumed by every mistake you make by beating yourself up over it. You know you're capable, but you don't fully believe in yourself. And in every situation, the worst scenario is your biggest thought. 5.
Really interesting. So I agree with some of these. Don't quite agree or think there's a little bit more nuance to some of the others. So let's take a quick look at this, okay? So 5 things you don't realize you're doing because you have high functioning anxiety. Let's take a look.
Things you don't realize you're doing because of your high functioning anxiety. You're nice and easy to be around, but you people please too much.
100% agree. So let's talk about anxiety for a second. When you are afraid, so let's define anxiety, okay? And if you, so let's define anxiety. So anxiety is essentially our brain's capacity to look into the future and predict problems, right? That's what anxiety is. I'm worried about the future. So our brain has this capacity to like predict what's going to happen and warn us of potential dangers. Now, in a social situation, if you have anxiety, what people may perceive is that you're super chill and easy to be around, but that's because you're so terrified of the consequences of getting a toe out of line that you end up being somewhat of a doormat, right? So then like you're going to be so conflict avoidant due to your anxiety, but there are other reasons for conflict avoidance, which we'll get to in a second, that you end up people pleasing too much and it looks good from the outside, right? So if you find yourself being really, really easy to get along with, and the reason you're so easy to get along with is because you never advocate for yourself, or someone's like, well, hey, what do you want to eat today? And you're like, oh, whatever you want to eat. If you're one of those people, that could be anxiety related.
You obsess over trivial things that other people probably don't even notice.
That too is 100% correct. So you obsess over trivial things that other people don't even notice. Let's be clear. Something that's a little bit wrong with this, which is that the thing isn't trivial, right? If you have anxiety, the whole point is that it's not trivial. To anyone else, it's trivial, but don't these people understand that this is terrifying? If we don't do this right now, like, oh my God, don't you see what could happen? We can't let the kid climb on the chair. What if the kid falls? Busts open their head. Oh my God. The whole point is when you have anxiety, things that appear trivial to other people aren't actually trivial to you. Quite the opposite, right? Everything becomes, not everything, but things that you have anxiety over become high consequence things that seem simple to other people. And then furthermore, when you try to communicate to people and you say like, oh my God, like we can't do this because of this. And then I'm like, what are you talking about? It's not that big of a deal, right? It's kind of like there's a disconnect between you and the rest of the world. That in turn leads to isolation.
You're consumed by every mistake you make by beating yourself up over it.
So this is a little bit nuanced, but I wouldn't quite say this is anxiety related. So this has to do with self-worth. And this is oftentimes what happens to people with anxiety. So this is kind of like one step away, okay? What do I mean by that? When I have anxiety, so this is where anxiety and self-worth start to tie together, okay? So when I have anxiety and I think things are important and other people think they're trivial. When I have anxiety and I'm concerned about the social impacts of setting limits with my friends and I end up being a doormat, that has effects on my identity. So let's talk about this, okay? So, doormat. Why? I'm afraid people won't like me. And then second thing, what was the other thing? Oh yeah, trivial. this could be catastrophic. Now, as a psychiatrist, this is how I would look at these two things. These two things are anxiety. And what does this mean? Anxiety, remember, because what is anxiety? Anxiety is thoughts, worries about the future, right? Negative consequences that will happen in the future due to my current actions. So I'm not going to set a limit with my friends, so people think I'm really easy to get along with, but I end up being a doormat. That is due to anxiety. This thing is trivial to other people, but it is not trivial to me. I'm afraid of a catastrophic consequence. That is also anxiety. Now, this next thing of making mistakes, beating yourself up, is not anxiety. You may say that's kind of weird, but let's just think about it. When I beat myself up, am I worried about some consequences in the future? No, it's because of a mistake that was made in the past, and I am attributing responsibility to myself. This is actually default mode network. Okay, so if y'all have seen Dr. K's Guide to Depression and Anxiety, there's a lot of good information that explains this. But essentially what happens is that when we experience these top two things a lot, okay, what it does is shapes our sense of identity, right? Because when I'm the doormat over and over and over again, even doormat, this is where doormat is. Now my personality, my identity has changed. When I think things are trivial, and when I think that something is very catastrophic and everyone else in the room thinks it's trivial, when I'm panicking about the cops showing up at a party where there's underage drinking and everyone else is getting hammered, there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between me and the outside world. Everyone else is having a good time socially, but the only reason that, they all get to do what they want to do, but I'm a doormat, so I never advocate for myself. So this creates a disconnect between you and the outside world. When you create a disconnect between you and the outside world, it affects your identity. Tells you I'm wrong. Right? Fundamentally, because it's important to me and everyone else seems to be fine, so I'm wrong. You learn this about yourself. Then what happens is when a mistake is made, if your identity says I'm the one at fault, then what you end up doing is beating yourself up. The tricky thing, though, is clinically, if I start someone on an anti-anxiety medication, I may reduce this and I may reduce this, but this will not be changed. Does that make sense? So anti-anxiety treatment can focus on this stuff generally, like medications. So if I alter my brain chemistry, but the identity stuff is a deeper kind of work. And even if I sort of fix these thought processes, the identity will linger and needs to be worked on in a completely different way. Okay? Let's see what else they've got.
You know you're capable, but you don't fully believe in yourself.
Same thing, right? So we've already accounted for that. So if I'm the one who's wrong, logically, I'm capable. But because of this disconnect with the outside world, I lack confidence. So capability and confidence are completely different things. Capability is the capacity to do something. Confidence is the belief that you can do it, right? That you can accomplish it, you can succeed. And these are the identity issues that I see with people who have anxiety for a long period of time. They lose faith in themselves. They start to think about themselves in a different way. So this is where you can look at stuff on the default mode network. We're not going to go into that now. So this is the part of our brain that is has the capacity for self-reflection and is more involved in depression. So when people are super depressed, they can only think about themselves. It's metacognition. So, why is this going wrong? Because it's my fault. Why is my family doing poorly? Because I'm not able to make enough money at work. Why is my kid sick? Because I didn't take care of them properly. Everything that's happening around you, you start to believe that you're at fault. And that is governed through the default mode network. So this identity stuff are consequences of anxiety, but interestingly enough, have a different solution. because you have to work on your sense of identity. You have to start to dig into, when did I start to believe this about myself, and how did I form those beliefs? And as you undo that, your confidence will grow. The interesting thing is that you can work on this and build confidence, but then this upper level anxiety may still exist. These are actually somewhat independent parts of your thought process, brain, psychology, psyche, call it whatever you want.
And in every situation, the worst scenario is your biggest thought.
Yeah, that's basically the definition of anxiety, right? So you're able to look at like the most terrible things very, very easily. That's what separates anxiety from sort of regular thinking. Good TikTok. Does that make sense? Okay.
Oh God, I'll never make it this time! This is the end! Anyway.
Okay, I guess that's the whole thing. Okay, so this is actually pretty good. So this is what people don't understand about panic attacks. So panic attacks are not rational. They're actually... The nature of a panic attack is that people think about a panic attack as like a mental... We diagnose it as a psychiatric illness, right? So we assume it's psychological in nature. But a big feature of panic attacks, in fact, one of the key diagnostic features of a panic attack is that it is like untriggered. It happens randomly. So sometimes panic attacks can be triggered. But if you look at panic disorder, which is a diagnosis, one of the more specific features of panic disorder is that it strikes like a thunderbolt out of the blue. Like it just comes out of nowhere, hits you really hard, has a strong physiologic response. So panic attacks aren't necessarily mental in origin. They can have thoughts associated with them, but they can be like physiological kind of in their origin. This is part of the reason also why I think that as a field, we're not great at treating panic attacks, because in the West, what we've managed to do is separate out mental health from physical health, right? You have a therapist who may be a psychologist who has basically no training in physiology. And then you have all these people who have a ton of training in physiology who are not treating panic attacks, right? So so you'll have family medicine physicians and primary care physicians, general practitioners, psychiatrists. We all have a lot of training in physiology. But I think that if we start to have better understanding of physiology, we'll improve panic attacks a lot. The other thing to remember about panic attacks is that they do disappear. So a lot of times people who say they have panic attacks are not actually having panic attacks. Oh my God, I got triggered and I had a panic attack. It's not a real panic attack. Ironically, a lot of the people who are actually having panic attacks have no idea that they have panic attacks because it is such a foreign experience. Because you see all these people online talking about, oh my God, I had a panic attack. Oh my God. They put walnuts in my dessert and I specifically asked for peanuts, not walnuts, and I had a panic attack. So people toss around this term panic attack so much that the people with actual panic attacks think they're absolutely insane. Why? Because panic attacks are a random sense of impending doom that you're going to die. That's what it feels like. So like when people have a panic attack, they're like walking down the street and they buy a cupcake and then suddenly they like literally feel like they're going to die. Like their heart starts beating really hard. They start sweating. They're 24 years old. They're an athlete. They're in perfect health. They have no idea what the hell is wrong with them. They have to sit down. They don't understand what's happening to them. It's not even like a particular thought like I'm worried about this or I'm worried about that. There's just a sense of impending doom. And that's literally in the diagnostic criteria of the DSM. The phrase impending doom is in there. And then it kind of like goes away. And then people are just super confused. And then nothing happens for a couple weeks. And a month later, it happens again. And someone's like, what the hell is wrong with me? It's like, I just feel like I'm going to die randomly for an hour once a month. So it's actually, it's crazy. But this is actually a pretty good representation where you feel like you're going to die and then it's kind of like over and then you just go about with the rest of your day. And then you feel insane talking to someone about it. Like you go to your doctor and your doctor's like, what can I help you with? Well, like 2 weeks ago, I just felt like I was going to die for a few minutes or like half an hour. I'm like, okay, how do you feel now? I feel fine. Yeah, I'm not going to go to the doctor for that. A month later, it happens again. It's like, oh my God, it's happening again. This time I'm going to die. And it just goes away. And so some people will have, 5, 6, 7 panic attacks a year, won't get diagnosed for decades. Because it just feels so bizarre. Okay. I guess this is overthinking. So this is something that, okay, read it. So this person was kind of saying, let me try one more time. Texting someone who makes me really happy. And then suddenly I wonder if I'm being annoying. Are they talking to other people? What if I don't make them as happy as they make me? Right? So sometimes we text people. So this is also pretty classic about anxiety. So this is why having anxiety makes it hard to have fun in normal life. Because there are the regular humans who participate in this thing called life. And the regular humans get to do things like text each other, right? If I like someone, I just text them. But the worse your anxiety is, the less you get to just do things like that. Because then you start to think about, okay, well, what if this person feels like I'm bothering them? What if? And if your mind finds you asking yourself, what if? And then suddenly like this simple experience, which you used to be able to enjoy, now becomes like plagued with all these what ifs and then like shatters it for you. That's a real problem. So I see that a lot in people with anxiety. A couple of other things to think about here is that generally speaking, if you look at what's going on in the mind here, this is a situation where this person is essentially, they step away from the experience and into thought about the experience. So this is where meditation can really help because like, you know, the joy that you had when you were texting this person has now disappeared in this fog of like thoughts and what if. And so what happens is your enjoyment of like this thing, you don't get to participate in it anymore. It's like now you're thinking about it instead of actually doing it. And so especially with social anxiety, there are a lot of situations where people are like, you know, you can't enjoy parties, for example, because like other people are there doing the enjoyment, like at the party, and all you're thinking about is what they think about you. Oh, am I being funny enough? Am I being annoying? You know, am I drinking too much? I turned that person down and now I'm drinking less. You know, like what are they thinking about? Right? So it's kind of, so what it does is kind of robs you of the experience. And that's really challenging. So if you're overthinking a lot, you know, this is the kind of thing where slowing down your mind and learning to be present and recognizing that your mind can have all those worries. But essentially what you want to do is stop thinking about the other person thinking about you. And instead, I know it sounds kind of weird, but think about the other person. So if you're sending a text, what anxiety does is makes you think about their impression of you and then causes you to pump the brakes, right? Oh my God, what if they think this? Therefore, I'm not going to do it. But what you're actually thinking of is their opinion of you. Instead, just think about them. I'm going to send this person a text message because I care about them and I want to make their day a little bit better, so I'm going to text them. And don't think about what they're going to think about you, right? So step away from that. Recognize, who are you focused on? Are you focused on yourself or are you focused on your friend? And the more that you can focus on your friend, the less into this anxiety you will get. If that makes sense. Okay. Does that make sense? Because like you're actually thinking about yourself. So don't do that. I mean, I say don't do that. If you all want tools and stuff, meditation, check out Dr. K's guide. You know, we have a lot of details about how to deal with that. Okay. You got to stop overthinking, man. I will stop when I stop being right. Okay, this is great. You got to stop overthinking. All right, so this isn't Dr. K's guide too, but we're going to talk about it right here. So let's understand this. We think about anxiety as a disorder, right? And it absolutely is because it impairs function. But do y'all know why anxiety is so damn prevalent? because it works, because it's correct. This is a big thing that you have to understand about anxiety. A lot of people think that anxiety is like logically incorrect and is a sign of a pathological mind, that what your mind is generating is incorrect. This is the worst way to help someone with anxiety, including yourself. The first thing you have to understand about anxiety is that it's right, not that it's wrong. Then you can deal with it. Because what happens when people try to say, oh, just don't worry about that, man, right? Even now I said, just stop thinking about yourself and start thinking about them. It's invalidating, sure, but it's incorrect. So when you're, and we learn this as psychiatrists, right? So when I have a patient who's suicidal and doesn't see a reason to live, this sounds kind of weird, but the right move is not, hey man, you have so many reasons to live, let me try to convince you of all of them. Because that's me operating from over here and they're operating from over here. It's a fundamentally different place. The right move as a psychiatrist is, help me understand why you have no reasons to live. Let me see what it's like to be in your situation. And then bizarrely, it's even, oh crap, like I can totally see why you would feel that way, because hearing your perspective, it sounds like you genuinely don't have a lot to live for. I don't know if I entirely agree with that, but I can absolutely see that your job is going nowhere. You just got dumped by your significant other. A pet of yours just passed away. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You don't really know what to do with yourself. I can see why you have nothing to look forward to in life. Now, I don't think you should kill yourself. I don't think that that means that it's going to be this way forever, but I can totally get where you're coming from. So the thing to understand about anxiety is that the reason it propagates is not because it's wrong, is because it's right. That's why it's so prevalent. That's why it grows so much. Because when you're anxious about doing something and your anxiety is like, oh, don't do that, it's not going to go well, and you dig real deep and you do it, and the catastrophic thing doesn't happen, what happens to your anxiety? Does it learn its lesson? No. Because the next time around it says, don't do that, it's going to end badly. You do it anyway. Dig real deep. Overcome your anxiety. Does it go away? No. Third time. Don't do that. You do it. The catastrophe happens. Or because of your cognitive bias, something bad happens, which isn't the exact catastrophe, but because of your cognitive bias gets distorted out of proportion. And then the anxiety is like, I told you so. I'm looking out for you. You're not listening to me. I'm going to double down and tell you not to do it 10 times more. Because occasionally your anxiety is right. That's the reason those thoughts propagate, right? Because it's correct. Now, there may be cognitive distortion there, and that's where there's work that can be done. But essentially, the reason that anxiety propagates is because it's right, not because it's wrong. And once you acknowledge that, once you realize that actually my anxiety is correct and that these people, let's talk about jobs, for instance, right? If I set a limit with my boss, there's a chance they could fire me. Let's say 30% of bosses, or even 50% of bosses, will fire me if I set a limit with them. Let's assume that's true for a minute. And if it doesn't happen the first time, the second time you do it, you get fired, then your anxiety is like, I told you so. Listen to me next time. I'm not going to go away. Now I'm going to double the amount of thoughts that I produce in your mind because I got to look out for you because you're an idiot. Because half of them you don't listen to. That's what your anxiety does. So instead, what you need to do is don't try to convince your anxiety it's wrong. You know what? You're right. 50% of bosses are going to fire me if I settle in with them. The next question you want to ask is, am I okay being fired 50% of the time to work in a place where I can set limits around work and I can develop a work-life balance? What's more important to me? That's how you overcome anxiety. It's not about dismantling it. It's about acting in spite of it. It's about acknowledging, yes, that anxiety is correct, and the way that the anxiety shapes my life is not a life that I want to live. Because that's the real problem with anxiety. It's not about it being right or wrong. That's where everyone gets tripped up. Because we try to convince ourselves that our anxiety is wrong. That's not right. The key thing is, which way do I want to live my life? Do I want to live my life where I'm protected from being fired, but result in a toxic work environment? Or am I willing to accept that catastrophe, accept that consequence for the sake of building a life that I am happy with? That's the real treatment to anxiety. So I've seen that a lot, for example, with I've worked with people who are non-binary, not heterosexual, who are trying to come out to their parents. and they're afraid of their parents' reaction. It's like you can't control that. And that's like, the question is, do you want to continue living in the closet, or do you want to share a piece of who you are and tolerate the possibility of rejection? And it's ultimately about building the life that you want to. And the real problem with anxiety is not that it's wrong. In fact, quite the opposite, it's right. The real problem is that because it's right, some of the time, you shape your entire life around it. And then your anxiety controls you. It protects you, but it controls you. Because that's what it's there for. It's there to look out for you, right? So then you never leave home. You never leave the house. In the worst cases, we see something like agoraphobia, which is literally the inability to leave the house because of what could happen. And your agoraphobia is right. It could happen. Question is, which way do you want to live? Right? That's the problem with anxiety. It's not that it's wrong. Quite the opposite, actually. Okay. The 3 biggest things not to say to someone with social anxiety.
Things not to say to somebody with social anxiety. Number 1 being the biggest. Number 3, I know how you feel. I'm shy too. Being shy and feeling like your heart is doing the fucking renegade in your chest are 2 completely different things.
Let's talk about that for a second. So, when someone has a clinical disorder, a lot of times what we'll try to do is empathize with them by sharing our own experience. And that's sort of like, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, to be honest, where shyness is not anxiety. In fact, there are lots of studies that show that shyness is not correlated with anxiety, actually, as strange as that sounds. Shyness is a personality characteristic that appears to be completely independent of a clinical anxiety disorder. So in a sense, like I kind of agree with you because it's sort of like if someone's really experiencing a disorder, you may have experienced something, but it's unclear whether shyness or what your experience of something is really correlates or is anything similar to what their experience is. So then the question is, okay, then what should you say instead, right? So if someone says they're anxious, what I would say is, help me understand that, right? Don't assume that you already know what that's like. What is that like for you? Or even ask if you have a particular experience, you can even ask them. You can say, hey, so sometimes I've struggled a lot with shyness. Is that anything like anxiety? What do you think? So you can still sort of put it out there a little bit, right? And it's not, I don't blame you for trying to connect with another human being. But this is where oftentimes what we try to do as human beings is we'll take the shortcut to connection, which is to assume that your experience is their experience. Oh my God, your father passed away? I'm so sorry. I lost my dad a couple of years ago and it was absolutely devastating. And the person that you're talking to was like, well, actually my father was an abusive asshole, so I don't miss him at all and I feel a sense of relief. Just because you share an experience like on paper does not mean that your actual experience is similar at all, right? So it's okay to try to take that shortcut and say, oh, I know what it's like to be a parent. Well, maybe you have no idea. Maybe one person has a special needs child, you don't have a special needs child. I don't think those experiences are similar at all, to be honest. Based on what I've seen, it's like night and day. It's not even, you can't even call both of them parenthood. The challenges that people with special needs children have are so astronomical. That also varies depending on, how severe the needs of your child are. But it's like night and day. So you can always ask. It's nice to be able to connect, but don't assume that your experience makes you understand what they've been through.
2, we all feel nervous sometimes. Dude, comparing nerves to an anxiety disorder is like comparing my skinny ass to the Hulk. And number 1.
Okay. So that too, I think is general same thing, right? It's this idea that you can generalize experience. But I'm also getting kind of a vibe from this person that this response feels to me a little bit like a traumatic kind of response because I don't think these people are trying to be mean to them, right? I get the sense that this person has really been burned by not feeling understood by other people, or that other people have assumed that they understand what this person's experience is like. And the third possibility, which I know we usually don't talk about when it comes to mental health, is that this in and of itself could be quite a narcissistic reaction. Whereas it's possible that your experiences aren't quite as unique as you think they are, and that a lot of people do actually experience what you go through, maybe closer than you're willing to give it credit for. But some people who really struggle are so caught up that no one else can understand what I've been through. And that's actually the core feeling, which is that I feel fundamentally misunderstood. I feel fundamentally, and anyone who tries to understand me, I'm going to push them away. So you got to be a little bit careful about that. Nobody gets me. Well said.
Well, just stop worrying. Like, oh, okay. Well, let me just get my remote here and turn off my... No, idiot. The three...
That's a fair thing too. So this is where I really do think that that third one, and if a lot of people have done this to this person, I can sort of see why they would have kind of this narcissistic response, which is that like when people, you know, really devalue what your experience is and they're like, just whatever, right? Just work out, just change your mind. So this is something that we're generally speaking on a crusade against. And if someone has been through a life where a lot of people tell them, just stop worrying, just don't worry about it, I can totally understand how that person over time would begin to feel in their sense of identity that people don't fundamentally understand me, so stop trying. It's just frustrating, which absolutely makes sense. So it could be a narcissistic defense that still is like appropriate, if that kind of makes sense, right? This is pretty good. Okay, so I suffer from anxiety and depression. Interesting. How do I... Okay.
Anxiety and depression. How do those two energies go together? Like, ah! I'm afraid of the future.
I regret the past.
How did this happen?
I blame myself.
I need to face my fear.
I gotta lay down.
Beautiful. Beautifully put. So, what I like about... I like this on so many different levels. Let's start with the yogic approach. So, a couple thousand years ago, there were a bunch of yogis meditating in caves in the Himalayas. They realized one fundamental thing, that a mind that is not focused in the present will suffer. So they looked at the qualities of suffering of the mind, and they divided them into two big buckets. My mind can suffer because it's thinking about the future. That's what we're going to call worry. And my mind can suffer because it's thinking about the past, and that's what we call regret. Right? So like if this happened in the past, that's regret. If I'm worried about the consequences in the future, that's worry. And those two things are not a peaceful mind. And when we look at these two things, we may think, well, that's clearly like they're in opposite directions, right? So there's no connection there. But anxiety and depression go hand in hand. And here's the reason why. The first thing is that some of the worries, so if you ask someone, like I've asked patients, for example, do you have anxiety about the past or the future? And some of them will say, I have anxiety about the past. And that may sound kind of confusing at first, because how can you have anxiety about the past? But what they'll be anxious about is a past action's future consequences. So for example, I left my backpack in my professor's office. They are going to think I am such an idiot. So it's a past action that's future consequences cause anxiety. It's still technically thinking about the future, so I kind of lump that into anxiety. But there's some kind of connection between the past and the future there. So from a yogic perspective, these things can sort of feel kind of different. The interesting thing is that from a psychiatric perspective, we know that there are different neurotransmitter profiles for something called a neurovegetative depression and an anxious depression. So if we look at the diagnostic criteria of depression, we see that it can involve insomnia or hypersomnia. It can involve agitation, like physical agitation, or physical like slowness. So I don't feel like getting out of bed, or I'm restless. We can see that it can involve appetite gain or appetite loss, weight gain or weight loss. So I want you all to envision two different things. Two people both get diagnosed with depression. One of them sleeps too much, has trouble getting out of bed, and eats a lot, has a big appetite, gains 10 pounds. Another person is restless, can't sleep, fidgeting all the time, doesn't feel hungry, loses 10 pounds. We call both of these things psychiatrically depression, but there are two discrete processes going on. One is something called an anxious depression, which is the restlessness, hyperactive mind, lots and lots of thoughts, worrying about the future, restlessness, even though we kind of call that a depression. The other one is a neurovegetative depression, which is kind of like slowed down and stuff like that. So there's even some evidence, for example, that the medications that we use for each depression are different. So for example, the medications that we use for an anxious depression also treat anxiety disorders. So you can get like a 2-for-1 special. Whereas there are certain kinds of antidepressants that are what we call activating antidepressants, which will give people a boost of energy and kind of get them moving and stuff like that, wake them up. And if you give those to someone with an anxious depression, it's going to actually make some of their symptoms worse. So there are actually two discrete things. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about the default mode network, and this is where anxiety and depression can also kind of come into play. So when I have anxiety for a while, that can result in a change to my identity. I start to think a particular way about myself because of my consistent anxiety. So if I'm worrying about one thing and no one else is worrying about it, and that happens again and again and again and again, what I learn about myself, well, I'm different from other people. I'm an idiot because all these people are not worrying about something and I'm worrying about something. So over time, what we see with people who are anxiety is they start to have confidence problems. Their sense of identity starts to change, and specifically, they lose faith in themselves. And once you do that, then you sort of get into this issue of, I worry about the future because I don't have faith in myself, right? Because that sort of makes sense. And then we see that wombo combo of anxiety plus depression. Because I lack confidence in myself, the future is a dangerous place, because if I had faith, then I could handle things. But since I don't have faith in myself, since I've had so many bad social situations, since I'm unable to make friends, I'm depressed about the future. The future doesn't hold much for me because of the way that I've been in the past. So we get this sort of like anxious thoughts, which can be, day to day, like a particular thought that shapes your behavior. And then over time, that affects your identity. As your identity starts getting affected, we recruit this part of our brain called the default mode network. The default mode network is the part of our brain that thinks about us, metacognition. And in people who are very depressed, that part of the brain is hyperactive. So even in some of these interesting studies that we've seen on ketamine and stuff like that, the fastest acting treatment for depression is a ketamine infusion. By the way, this should be prescribed, okay? So don't do this at home. But the way that the mechanism of action of a ketamine infusion is that it disables the default mode network. So it makes you stop thinking about yourself. The other really interesting thing is that meditation, the mechanism of action, one mechanism of action through which meditation helps people with depression and anxiety is it also disables the default mode network. Right? So meditation leads to an egoless state. The death of ego is what enlightenment is. Ego death. You're no longer yourself. And so that has positive effects for depression and anxiety, all mediated through the default mode network, which is a bit of an oversimplification, but there's good science behind what I'm saying. Last thing we're going to talk about is psychedelics. Right? So there's promising research still in its preliminary stage. Once again, don't recommend that you do psychedelics because it can cause problems as well. I've seen PTSD and anxiety disorders develop from psychedelic use. But there's promising research that the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies has been doing for the last 20 or 30 years that shows that psychedelics for depression may work through disabling that default mode network. So anxiety and depression may seem from a yogic sense like they're very far apart. They're in opposite directions. One's about the past, one's about the future, one's about worry, one's about regret. But the more that we get into it, the more that we understand the neuroscience of the brain, the more that we understand that an anxious thought over time, when I interact with the world because of anxious thoughts, it can shape my confidence, it can shape my sense of identity. That's a long-term effect. And that shaping of my identity will result in depressive kind of thoughts, a lack of confidence. And then we get the wombo combo of anxiety plus depression. Interestingly enough, remember that antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications oftentimes overlap. So there's a common potential neurotransmitter effect, neurochemical effect in the brain that results in sort of benefiting both. So it's really good. Common. And if y'all are more interested in stuff like default mode network, understanding thought loops, check out Dr. K's Guide to Depression, Dr. K's Guide to Anxiety. Okay, last one. Also, there's stuff about identity in there too.
I don't think people understand anxiety very much. It's not like, oh, I'm so nervous to do that. It's like, if I walk one step to the right, are they going to think I'm too close? I don't think people understand anxiety very much. It's not like, oh, I'm so nervous to do that. It's like, if I walk one step to the right, are they gonna think I'm too close to them? And then are they gonna judge me for having bad posture right now? And is my face in the right shape? And am I acting the way I should be acting right now? And what should I say next? Is what I'm saying even making sense half of the time? It's not cute. It's not a trend. It is. I can't even live my life out here. I don't even know how to be a person.
Yeah, that's unfortunately so accurate. So, isn't this OCD? No, I don't think so. I mean, I can't diagnose someone in like 30 seconds, but generally speaking, no. So here's the thing. So if you look at anxious thoughts, one of the key features of anxiety, this is all in Dr. K's guide too, but let's talk about it now because, you know, we're here. So here's a key feature of the anxious thought process. This is why you really have to understand how your mind works if you want to like really overcome anxiety, okay? So here's how the anxious thought process works. I have thought one, and then that leads to thought two. That leads to thought three. That leads to thought four. And eventually, we get so exhausted, and each of these thoughts our mind tries to solve, right? Oh, so I try to come up with a solution. Maybe that solution doesn't really work. Solution. Because your mind is going to be thinking about solutions as well. Like with the posture thing, I need to sit up straight. But the speed at which your mind is moving is so fast that you can never fix all of these problems. And then eventually you kind of short circuit. This is what she's probably leaving out, but isn't true. And then you go back to thought number one. And so the thing about anxiety is that it's food for the mind because the mind can continue thinking. And what does the mind love to do? The mind loves to think. Thinking is food and energy for the mind. And the mind hates sitting still. So let me ask y'all a question. What does the mind hate more than anything else in the world? What will it kick and scream and avoid at all costs? Boredom. Very good. So when you are sitting there bored in the middle of the night, you will look at social media that makes you feel bad about yourself. You will choose, your mind will choose pain over boredom any day of the week. What it hates more than anything else is boredom. And it wants something to fill its stomach. It'll eat old food, it'll eat rotten food, it'll eat food that makes it sick. This is all this toxic stuff that we consume online, right? So like if everyone's like, you know, you read all this stuff online about how the world is falling apart, the environment is falling apart, the oceans are dying, climate change, war in Ukraine and Russia, nuclear proliferation, anti-work, people are getting abused, wealth gap, all this kind of stuff. Why do you think all of that content propagates? Think about that, right? The only reason it would propagate is if like people consumed it. Why the hell do people consume these things that make them feel bad? Because it's an antidote to boredom. Because here's the thing. The mind loves the never-ending, the golden goose for a mind. The complete antidote for the mind that does not want boredom is a problem that cannot be solved. Climate change. Why are so many people worried about climate change? Because the mind loves it. It's a never-ending source of anxiety. So it'll always be moving, always be moving, always be moving. Right? And that's why like the solutions never matter in anxiety. Your mind moves so quickly because it doesn't actually want to solve things. If you solve it, then that thought's going to go away. You're going to run out of food. If you solve this, then this thought is going to go away. I'm going to run out of food. Run out of food. Run out of food. Then I'm going to be bored. So, this pattern of thoughts, understanding what happens. So there's a video about the mechanism of anxiety. So how does anxiety literally work in your mind? This is a yogic perspective, not a psychiatric one. What does it do to the frequency of your thoughts, the duration of your thoughts? How does one thought lead into another one? How do you learn to control that? Right? You have to understand these things, that your mind dislikes boredom. This is why meditation is very, very helpful. There's neuroscience stuff that backs this stuff up too. So we find that people who are better at controlling anxiety have stronger frontal lobes and can direct their thoughts in a particular direction. So we want to strengthen our frontal lobes. We want our mind to be able to do what we tell it to do. And how do we do that? Through something like meditation. There are other practices as well. So I think, unfortunately, this person captures it very well, which is like anxiety is just a string of problems that can never be solved. And then they start to cycle, they repeat, they branch off into different places. But the key thing is that one thought generates another thought, generates another thought, generates another thought, generates another thought. And when it gets to be too much to handle, our mind short circuits and starts over again. Let's run it through again. Right? And then someone's talking about smoking weed. Yeah, that's why people love to smoke weed. Because what does it do to that process? Slows it all down until the weed wears off. And then this thought amplifies. And then you have to smoke again. And then people say weed isn't addictive because you don't develop a physiologic tolerance to it. Sure. You're not going to have seizures and arrhythmias like you will if you're withdrawing from alcohol that can be lethal. You're not going to have cold sweats and diarrhea the way that you would with opiate withdrawal. Agree with that. But it's psychologically addictive, absolutely. Just like a video game. You're not going to go through physiologic seizures if you stop playing video games, but it can absolutely be addictive. So what do we do when we're anxious? We try to find ways to shut our mind down, which makes sense. I don't blame people for doing that. And to recognize that this is something that you can learn to deal with, right? So I say that with a lot of confidence as a psychiatric professional. So I've had people come into my office with bad anxiety for 15 years. Right? You work at it for a while, you figure out the psychological origins of why you get worried about the things that you get worried about. Where does the birth of anxiety come from? Because that comes from somewhere too. There's a reason why one person is worried about social things and another person is worried about the climate. That comes from somewhere. It comes from an internal experience. There's a reason why you are afraid of the things that you're afraid of. So get to the origin of it. Learn to understand how the mind works in the present. What is the function? What is the mechanism of anxiety in your mind? And then start to engage in practices that will, help you restrain that mind. Even alter your diet. There's some evidence, for example, that gut microbiome can influence how anxious you feel. There's all kinds of stuff that goes into it. Really fascinating stuff. So we're past our time for today. I think we're going to have to skip meditation once again. I'm going to really focus on making sure I can speak well enough to do meditation on Friday. And if y'all have, so I think this is the challenge, is that a lot of the more deeper stuff for these TikToks, y'all can find in Dr. K's guide. That's where we go into more detail about this kind of stuff. But we're going to do our best to sort of explain some of these key principles in response to the TikToks. So hopefully y'all can get something out of this. But who are we rating, by the way? And I'll definitely try to leave time for meditation on Friday, okay? Chat withdrawal? Okay, we can rate Maya. What's her actual Maya? Is it just Maya? Or is it something else? Oh, she's done? She's out. Okay, then who else? Asmongold? I'm gonna rate Asmongold. All right. Asmongold it is. All right, so send Asmongold some love. We'll see y'all on Friday. Let's find a small streamer to rate on Friday, and we're going to do meditation, okay? I'm going to focus on my cough. Love y'all. Take care. I will see y'all on the Friday.